Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon in Egypt Part 5 by Extra History. I will not be saying that title in the first minute of my video because I'm pretty sure I'll get demonetized. Anyway, last time we ended with Napoleon ditching Egypt and heading back to France. I imagine in this video we will be covering the aftermath of that decision, some interesting stuff. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Cairo, August 1799.
That Corsican runt!
General Klebera shouts as he storms into the meeting with his generals. In his hand, he clutches a long letter from Bonaparte. It informs him that he's now in charge of the French forces in Egypt and offers detailed instructions for running the occupation. Napoleon, he's just learned, has returned to France.
Look, and I understand why Klebera is upset. I absolutely would be as well. But, as I said last time, it does seem like Napoleon did intend to meet with Klebera, and Klebera actually didn't make it to the meeting, and so Napoleon decided, well, this whole thing is a secret, I don't have the time to wait, I'll write a letter, and then I'll go. Now, you can still absolutely make the argument that Napoleon should have told more people around him, given them more time to prepare, but he did intend to meet with Klebera at least once. It just didn't end up happening, and so Klebera had to find out through this letter.
Leaving Klebera with a deteriorating military situation. The British are preparing a land force, the Arabs are in open revolt, and the French army is undersupplied, depleted, and plague-stricken. Summarizing the situation, he tells his staff,
That bugger has deserted us with his breeches full of shit. When we get back to
I feel like Extra History usually doesn't swear, you know what I mean?
Europe, we'll ram it in his face.
but none of them will dare do so. For Napoleon is only 3 months away from ruling France, and Klebera won't make it back to Europe at all. Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. When the Directory heard that Napoleon had returned to France, their first instinct was to put him on trial, which seemed reasonable. After years of infrequent contact and ruling Egypt independently from their control, he'd suddenly abandoned his post without orders.
Well, actually, that is technically true. So, yes, the Directory, especially Napoleon's enemies within the Directory, wanted to charge him for abandoning his post. But what actually happened was that the Directory had sent letters back to Napoleon asking him to return. Remember, France was in a pretty dire state. So they actually had sent requests for him to return, but Napoleon had never received them. So, yes, technically Napoleon had returned without receiving orders to return, but the Directory had actually sent those orders. Napoleon just hadn't received them.
Sure, they had discussed him coming back, but they definitely hadn't called for him.
No, that's not true. That's not true, actually. They'd done more than discuss. They had called for it, technically. They had sent the orders to Napoleon, but he just never received them.
Yet any thoughts of punishment quickly disappeared on October 9th as Bonaparte's carriage pulled up outside and crowds thronged the streets, cheering for the hero of Egypt.
Yeah, and so the reason the Directory decided not to charge him wasn't because of that technicality. Oh, we have technically sent these orders to Napoleon. No, it's because the Directory was a very corrupt and unpopular government. The people of France really did not like it. On the other hand, Napoleon was extremely popular. He was seen as a hero of the Republic. When he returned, there were spontaneous celebrations throughout the streets of many French cities. People were exuberant. They were very happy to see him. And the Directory, in comparison, was unpopular and weak. They felt they literally did not have the political power, the clout they needed to prosecute Napoleon.
He and his officers came in with style, displaying Mameluke sabers, exotic sashes, and tanned complexions. Only a month later, the Directory, already weakened by intrigues among its members, fell to a coup. Napoleon himself being the chief plotter and beneficiary, and in the wake of this, he took up the position of first consul.
Yeah, Napoleon was certainly the chief beneficiary of the coup. Chief plotter, it's a little more complicated than that. This coup was actually initially separate from Napoleon, and I would say was really spearheaded by the Abbé Sieyès, this very prominent character throughout the French Revolution. Napoleon's brother, Lucien Bonaparte, was involved, Talleyrand was involved, and eventually they turned to Napoleon to help them realize this coup. Now, after that point, Napoleon monopolized the planning, he took control, and he turned it from the plan that already existed into a plan that would put him in power. But this was not a coup that had originated from Napoleon initially. It's one that he got, not roped into, but he was asked to join. Though, I think what was clear is that Napoleon already had visions of grandeur and surely would have done something on his own if he hadn't been offered that position.
Essentially, a military dictator. You see, while the Egyptian campaign was a mess to anyone who'd witnessed it, Bonaparte had successfully managed to portray it through his letters and dispatches as a glorious campaign. And a large part of that was due to a group of men we've only touched on thus far in this series, the savants.
Yes, and as we've seen throughout this series and throughout all of our content on Napoleon, this man was a spinster. He was a brilliant propagandist. This campaign in Egypt, now whether you think it was a total disaster or it was more down the middle, you have to admit, this was not a glorious success, not like Napoleon had seen in Italy, for example. But when Napoleon brought all the stories back to the general public, do you think he was writing accurate depictions of failed sieges and marches through the desert? No, of course not. He was having his men write about impressive battles, bringing back heroic paintings of himself. Napoleon was a brilliant, brilliant propagandist, and so, while I don't think the Egyptian campaign was necessarily the biggest part of building Napoleon's reputation at this point, I think his campaigns in Italy were more important. It played a role in building his reputation, making the people love him even more than they already did.
Though the invasion of Egypt was for all intents and purposes a grab for colonies and resources, Napoleon's cadre of scientists, naturalists, geologists, and engineers had granted it a veneer of humanitarianism. France wasn't just taking territory, no, it was expanding knowledge. The irony, of course, was that the savants themselves were universally miserable and abused. Soldiers thought of them as you.
Yeah, it's not really surprising, but these scholars had a real bad time in Egypt. They collected some really interesting stuff, did some really fascinating research, but on a sort of day-to-day level, they did not live the most fun lives while they were there.
Useless, and there was widespread resentment against them from the beginning. The army incorrectly came to believe that these academics had been the ones to propose and lobby for the expedition, meaning troops blamed them for being stranded in Egypt. They also hilariously thought...
Which is funny because, you can debate to what extent Napoleon was genuinely invested in this scientific humanitarian mission, but it definitely was not what caused Napoleon to begin this campaign in Egypt. It might have been one of the factors, but it probably wasn't even the main one. I think it was more about building Napoleon's reputation and altering geopolitics, taking a stab at the Brits. So it's kind of funny to look at that and then say, these damn scholars, they're the reason for this whole thing. I don't think so.
That the savants were looting treasures from the ancient tombs, meaning that soldiers frequently rifled through their baggage and sample jars, hoping to find gold. Yet the savants tried their best. They stayed with the army on the initial march to Cairo, and were subject to the outbreaks of blindness, extreme thirst, and Bedouin attacks. During the crossing of the desert, they made one of their first studies of new phenomena, investigating why soldiers sighted lakes on the horizon, only to see them disappear as they approached.
That's fascinating.
Oh yeah. The first big study the French did was on mirages. And, if you're thinking that modern historians probably like using that as a metaphor for the expedition as a whole, you'd be very right.
Of course.
But it was in Cairo where their work began in earnest. Told to find a suitable headquarters, they took over an abandoned Mamluk palace and renamed it the Egyptian Institute. This building would become a clearinghouse for information, a library to keep documents, a store for antiquities and samples, and a scientific institute. Savants would gather in the palace's former harems for lectures, as they presented their findings via formal papers on everything from taxonomy of Egyptian wildlife to research into mummification.
And it seems appropriate at this point. I'm not sure if we're going to get to the exact thing I'm about to say, but considering we're talking about this whole scientific mission, it seems appropriate to talk about the long-term impacts of Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Now, particularly on a sort of scholarly level, right? Now, I think there were a lot of different impacts, and oftentimes the Egyptian expedition is sort of minimized because it might not have been as successful as Napoleon had wanted. Maybe it didn't build him up as much as some of his other achievements, but the sort of impacts on the culture and intellectual space of the Western world, mainly Europe and North America, shouldn't be ignored. It was very important. In fact, after this occurred, Napoleon's scholars collected all these different artifacts, did all this writing, studied the architecture, studied the animals. There was this big, what we call Egyptomania, or an Egypt craze throughout the Western world in the coming decades. And I know a little bit about this in the context of cemeteries, actually. I've done a bit of research on this in the past. During the sort of mid-1800s, there was this big movement to create big public cemeteries, because a lot of these churchyards, which is mostly where bodies were being buried, were getting absolutely packed, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, population levels skyrocketing. And a lot of these public cemeteries were very influenced by this whole Egyptomania. There was a lot of mausoleums, obelisks, etc., tombs in the style of ancient Egypt. And I think one of the most prominent examples of this, and one that's a little bit funny, is that in Britain, in I think the 1820s or 30s, architect Thomas Wilson had a proposal. Now, that issue I was talking about, all these churchyards and graveyards getting packed with dead bodies, that was happening in a lot of these industrializing countries. Britain was facing this issue big time. London was getting packed with dead bodies. It was causing disease. What actually ended up happening is they created a bunch of these big green cemeteries, which, we can still see today. And when you think about a cemetery today, that's probably what you'll think of. That is the route that they took. But Thomas Wilson had another idea. Instead of doing that, why don't, in the middle of London, we build a gigantic pyramid that we can host all the dead bodies in? That was his idea. Didn't end up happening, but it shows you how entranced with Egyptian history, culture, and customs the people of the Western world became after Napoleon's time in Egypt when he brought back all of this information. So that is one of the long-term consequences of this whole thing that is definitely worth talking about.
Savants also spread out over Egypt to pursue niche interests or specialties. One would collect new invertebrates and insects, while another visited the Red Sea ports to dredge up shells, starfish, and other small marine animals. And as the French army pursued Murad Bey into Upper Egypt, several savants came along in order to survey and draw the temple complexes of Luxor, Thebes, and a half-dozen others. Most were abandoned, with the local population giving them a wide berth, and one had even been used to dump bodies of execution victims. But the scale drawings of these palaces and ink prints of their hieroglyphics would in many ways become more important than the artifacts they brought back to France. And of course, just before Napoleon's departure, engineers conducting restoration work on a fort uncovered...
I think that's true, just to go back on that. Of course the artifacts themselves were super important. And if we're talking about the academic side of thing, then of course the artifacts were the most important part. Studying things like the Rosetta Stone, which I think is what we're seeing here, or some of these other architects, there was big leaps forward in the study of Egypt and the ancient world. But if we're talking about popular culture, your average person, well, it's not like they were really going to be going and studying or even seeing these artifacts. So what was more influential broadly was the accounts written up by these scholars, or the drawings they did, the things they noted down that would be spread throughout Europe in pamphlets, newspapers, books that your average person might have access to. So in terms of popular culture, I think that's absolutely right.
in ancient Egyptian stele in 3 languages. The Rosetta Stone.
There you go.
The key to translating hieroglyphics. And let me tell you, that's enough of a story to warrant its own episode. I wonder when that will be happening. Wink. But not all of this work was meant to increase knowledge. The savants and artists were also part of the imperialist machine. When Napoleon took Cairo, it was that civilian complement that built 2 massive victory arches out of wood and painted canvases to celebrate the victory at the Battle of the Pyramids.
Sure, and it gets a little complicated when we're talking about imperialism, because of course imperialism had been going on for a long, long time. But when we think about sort of modern imperialism, or I'm talking particularly about 19th century imperialism, think when Europe began to dominate the world, conquering a bunch of African, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries, what we might call modern imperialism, this was really one of the beginnings of that. And so we can see a lot of similarities. Now, however intentional or non-intentional it was, because there wasn't necessarily a roadmap to look back on, they were sort of blazing the path forward, right? And so when we look at imperial missions of this era, or particularly after this, of course, we always think about the military side of things. We think about maybe the commercial side of things. Imperial missions were often characterized by conquest or trade or economic domination, but it's more complicated than that. These imperial missions of the 19th century would also involve a religious element, the missionaries. I often say, when a missionary arrives in your non-European country in the 1800s, look out, there's probably going to be an army coming soon. They were really one of those branches of imperialism. Same thing with European explorers. A European explorer would go somewhere, map it out, and what does that do? Well, that allows the government to send more people. Researchers, academics, scholars, they played a role as well. And so imperialism was this very complicated machine that had a lot of moving parts. And of course, it would only get, far more complex and far more prevalent throughout the 19th century. But we can see a bit of that here, which I think is interesting.
Savants ran the printing presses that spat out the all-important propaganda, and several accompanied Bonaparte to the port of Suez to survey the ancient canal that once connected the Red Sea with the Nile.
The so-called Canal of the Pharaohs, which I think before they saw it was sort of unclear to what extent there was truth to that story or what, the actual situation was. And so that's one of the reasons Napoleon went to see it.
It was Napoleon's dream to redredge that canal, deep enough to accommodate modern trading and naval vessels. And
right. And, think about that. What do we get, relatively soon-ish? The Suez Canal. Not for a while, but you get the point. We're sort of building up to things like European imperialism or the Suez Canal or,
It was also what the savants were there for, to improve agriculture and make Egypt more productive as a French colony. Likewise, once the French were cut off by the Battle of the Nile, they were put to work manufacturing or finding replacements for any spare parts or other materials that they were no longer able to import from France. A group even created a sort of technological expo meant to overawe Egyptian leaders with the miracles of Western science. The argument being made was that the French were willing to bestow liberal government, technology, and infrastructure development in exchange for extracting Egypt's resources. Which might sound familiar if you're like a person who lives on Earth. The chronicler Al-Jabarti was present for this showcase and was impressed, apart from the demonstration of a hot air balloon which immediately caught fire and crashed among a crowd of screaming onlookers.
Yeah, and I'm sure that would be a very impressive thing to see, but also probably pretty dangerous. And that is exactly what happened. They were trying to show off their technology. The French were. Including hot air balloons, the miracle of flight, which is all well and good unless you manage to crash it, which sort of shows off the opposite, I guess. Makes a bad first impression.
And within months of Bonaparte's exit, it was clear that the French military situation was heading in a similar direction. General Klebera.
Alright, looks like we're returning to the situation on the ground. Napoleon has left, Klebera has been left in charge. They have, of course, the Ottomans to deal with, though they have been able to fend back both Mamluk and Ottoman forces pretty well. But worse, they have the Brits to deal with, and they've been the real issue this whole time. They have to contend with British naval power. That's what, Napoleon hasn't been able to get around that. Can Klebera?
Hashed out an agreement for a French withdrawal in January of 1800. But at the last minute, the British refused to sign it, and the Ottomans launched an enormous seaborne invasion.
Right, so in a little more detail, we're talking about the Convention of El Arish, which was a deal between the French and the Ottomans. Now, here's the situation. Technically, this is between the French and the Ottomans. The French have invaded Ottoman territory, even though the Ottomans didn't have much control over it. They have technically been fighting against the Ottomans, but haven't the Brits been here for all of this? Well, yes, they have, but they're not officially supposed to be involved in this negotiation process. It's supposed to be between the French and the Ottomans. And so they land on this Convention of El Arish, where basically the Ottomans would get Egypt back, and the French would be able to freely return to France on the Ottoman dime, aka the Ottoman Empire would allow for their safe passage, and they would pay for the upkeep of the French army as they returned back to their homeland. The Brits refused to sign this. That's all they did initially, but then they got new orders from their government that not only should they not sign this, but they couldn't cooperate either. And so the Brits basically stepped in, said, "Nuh-uh-uh, this ain't happening." And this deal, which I would say was a pretty good deal, I think Klebera was right to go for negotiations. He was right to seek peace instead of trying to keep this whole campaign going. I just don't think it was worth it. But unfortunately, this deal fell through really right at the end.
Though Klebera defeated it, a simultaneous revolt in Cairo and a fresh plague epidemic roiled the security situation for months, culminating when a 23-year-old student from Al-Azhar assassinated Klebera.
Yeah.
Command then fell to General...
So, under Klebera, like they mentioned, he had defeated the Mamelukes again. He had crushed another uprising in Cairo. This is basically Napoleon-esque activity, and Klebera was performing pretty well, pretty impressively. I mean, he was chosen for that job for a reason, and then he gets assassinated, and Manu takes over.
Abdullah de Manu, who had converted to Islam after marrying an Egyptian teenager. Manu, still unrealistically optimistic about the possibilities of a French colony in Egypt, dragged the occupation out for another year before a British Ottoman force defeated him in Alexandria. Always dismissive of the savants, Manu did not object when the British insisted that, as part of the surrender, they would hand over all Egyptian antiquities to be taken to the British Museum.
Right, and so the Brits defeat the French at Cairo, the French pull back to Alexandria, they're besieged, and then Manu is forced to capitulate after, they said, basically about another year of fighting. And so the funny thing is that the deal that is struck here is that the French will hand over some of these artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone. That's how the Brits end up with the Rosetta Stone. And the French will be allowed to return home. Now, does that sound familiar? Do we remember a similar deal about a year ago? The French being allowed to return home? So what has changed in the span of this year? A lot more fighting, a lot more death, a lot more destruction. Sheesh. Well, hope it was worth it.
Now, originally, the British also insisted that all the savants' notes and drawings also be surrendered, but after the academics threatened to destroy the documents rather than turn them over, they were allowed to keep them.
Yeah, and there's this quote, I really don't remember it well, but it was like one of the scholars said something like, basically, if you don't let me keep my notes, if you're going to try and take them, you'll be responsible for, like, the second destruction of the Library of Alexandria, or something like that. These scholars basically said, hey, if you don't let us keep our notes, we'll burn them all. Remember the destruction of the Library of Alexandria? We're doing it again. And so the Brits were like, all right, fine, keep your notes.
And these drawings, impressions, and studies would later be compiled into 37 volumes to make up the book Description of Egypt, at the time the largest book in the world. Its enormously detailed prints would, in particular, influence the exoticized Western view of Egypt.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about, how influential these drawings and writings and books and pamphlets were at the time and then for years to follow.
Up until the modern day. Though that wasn't the savants' only legacy. Their Egyptian Institute still exists as a center of Egyptology in Cairo today. The expedition also changed the course of Egyptian history. Muhammad Ali Pasha, one of the Ottoman commanders sent to eject the French in 1801, stayed, destroying the weakened Mamelukes and becoming the Ottoman governor of Egypt. Having witnessed French power, he, along with other Middle Eastern governments, embarked on a plan of reform and modernization, and his family would govern the country until a revolutionary coup gained Egypt full independence in 1952.
Yeah, Muhammad Ali Pasha, fascinating guy. I think a series on him would be great, frankly. He's sort of seen as the founder of modern Egypt. He was sent alongside an Albanian force to get a grip on things. But and I feel like we've talked about this before, as with a lot of these ambitious, skillful politicians or military leaders at the time, especially in the Ottoman Empire, they were looking out for themselves. And so basically, in the long term, Muhammad Ali, managed to gain control and rule Egypt on his own, solely. The Mamelukes tried to stay around. Muhammad Ali Pasha, basically purged them, got him out of there. The era of the Mamelukes was over, and Egypt went into not the era of Ottoman control. No, sorry, the Ottomans still basically couldn't control their own territory into the era of Muhammad Ali Pasha. And like they said, he modernized Egypt militarily, economically, culturally, purged the Mamelukes, established his own base of power. And he would fight against the Ottomans several times, but he never really... And he would fight, I would say, successfully against the Ottomans several times, but there was always a lot of European intervention that I would say sort of limited him from getting what he wanted or going the extent which he could have gone to. But a real fascinating character.
Napoleon, for his part, didn't really care about these changes on the ground. Egypt had served its purpose for him, for he'd rewritten the history of the expedition to suit his ever-increasing cult of personality. Paintings cast him as a heroic explorer, part scientist, part general, and, never hinted that he lost 30,000 men in a failure that gained nothing for France. Yet he did gain something personally, a taste for absolute power. The man who had ruled Egypt independently and referred to...
So, I will say, I've got a lot to say on this. First off, a taste for absolute power. There's sort of commonly this idea that, since Napoleon would head back to France immediately, and after a while would become emperor, immediately would seize power, and then after a while would become emperor. There's this idea that, ruling over Egypt, Napoleon picked up this taste for tyranny and power. I don't think this is entirely accurate. I think, first off, if we look at Napoleon, he already had a taste for those things. Look at his time in Italy. He was already doing things his own way. He was already following the footsteps of Julius Caesar, in my opinion. He was already running his own affairs, doing things his own way, ignoring the government. He already acted tyrannically. He treated his enemies brutally. So I don't think this is something that he learned from Egypt. I also think, and it's funny, they've talked a lot about Orientalism in this series, and, I don't think they're coming at it from this perspective, but I think oftentimes when people say that, it comes from a bit of an Orientalist perspective, the idea that Napoleon went to Egypt and there he picked up tyranny. Like, no, I think he learned tyranny in Europe, in the West. So there's that. And then, to look at the entire Egyptian expedition, there are the questions of what did Napoleon set out to do, and did he achieve those goals? I think he set out to do a couple of things. I mean, there was, of course, the whole humanitarian mission. I think mainly what Napoleon wanted to do was build his own reputation, build his own base of power, and then alter the geopolitics of the era. And by that, I mean he wanted to disrupt British Empire, disrupt British trade, and try to build French power abroad. Did he achieve these things? Well, I mean, certainly as a scholarly mission, he achieved a lot, though I think if you had to rank them, that may have been the lowest of his concerns. Did he manage to disrupt British Empire? Not really. The Brits kind of dunked on him, as we saw throughout this. And it sort of ended, I'd say, in a bit of a stalemate. Everything sort of returned to how it was in terms of the French and the British. So I would say, no, Napoleon failed to achieve that goal. And throughout this whole time, we've seen the Brits navally performing very well against the French and really hampering French efforts. And so then you get to the question of, did this build Napoleon's reputation? Was this the stepping stone that allowed him to take control in France, as it's often presented? And I would say it's complicated, sort of yes and no. I think this absolutely did build his reputation. I think Napoleon was able to propagandize this whole campaign very well, even though the whole thing wasn't that successful. He did a great job of writing back to the people of France and showing how cool and exotic he was and all that sort of stuff. Bringing all these items back to France. The people loved that. But, to be honest, I think when Napoleon returns to France and he manages to coup the government, I think that has far more to do with the successful military reputation he had already built up before Egypt, for example, in Italy, his political connections, and the unpopularity of the Directory than it had to do with his time in Egypt. So, yes, I do think it built his reputation, which I believe was one of his goals, but it certainly wasn't the most important part of his resume at this point. And as they said, throughout the rest of his career, the rest of his life, Napoleon would sort of downplay or sort of detach himself from his time in Egypt. He wouldn't talk about it that much. And Napoleon was quite the braggart. He loved to talk about his achievements. And so he would sort of leave Egypt behind. So for Napoleon, I'm not sure Egypt made that massive a difference in his trajectory. But as I've talked about in this video and in this whole series, if we zoom out and look at this campaign more broadly, people often just sort of broadly make the claim, well, Egypt didn't really matter that much. Yeah, I don't think it made much of a difference in the trajectory of Napoleon necessarily, but it was very influential. It was very influential in Middle Eastern history, very influential in Egyptian history. I mean, all of this, you got Muhammad Ali Pasha in charge, sort of sets Egypt up as this forefront power in the Middle East, modernization, brings the printing press to the Middle East, releases this whole Egypt craze in Europe and the Americas, a lot of academic study, cultural shifts. I mean, there were a lot of changes that occurred because of this campaign. I just think a lot of those changes were not to do with Napoleon's career. So, that's sort of my view on his goals and whether or not he achieved them.
To himself in proclamations as the great Sultan Bonaparte, had found what it was like to have a crown. And if Egypt would not let him be king, perhaps France would have him as an emperor. And I gotta say, even with all of the historical revisions Napoleon was able to pull off throughout his career, I am just glad he didn't have super powerful storytelling tools like World Anvil at his disposal.
All right. They're going into the ad. Check their video out, and you can check out their ad. So, that part they ended on, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with that framing. Napoleon tried to be a king in Egypt. They wouldn't take him, and so he instead tried to do it in France. I don't think it was that simple. Like I said, I think a lot of those tendencies were already there. And I think, in this series they emphasize that going to Egypt, Napoleon wanted to emulate some of his ancient heroes like Caesar and Alexander. But if you know anything about Napoleon, you'll know that he already wanted to emulate those guys back in Italy. He was already talking about himself as one of these ancient conquerors. So, while this might have built that image, I don't think it's as simple as that. And I certainly don't think any of those ideas started in Egypt. Anyway, I basically just gave my impression of the whole campaign. I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts down below. On this series overall, I know a lot of you have had a lot of issues with this series by Extra History. I think, if you have a spectrum of being favorable to Napoleon or not favorable, they're definitely on the more not favorable side. And they've certainly, I think, left some stuff out. But I think you guys do have to remember that we're talking about 5 episodes, each of which are around 10 minutes. There's a lot of, brevity there. They have to leave a lot of stuff out. And so, I do think they have to condense a lot of information down. And I think that broadly they sort of had the right idea, I think some of the information, they left some information out, but I think broadly, to be honest with you, they sort of gave the correct impression of Napoleon's time in Egypt, if a little disfavorable to Napoleon. Now, of course, that's all subjective. That's all opinion-based. So that basically depends on how you feel about Napoleon's time in Egypt, right? So like I said, this is the end of this series, but I will be doing their Lies episode. That will be, or I don't remember if I mentioned that. I will be reacting to their Lies episode, but that will be a channel member and patron exclusive. So if you're watching this in my Napoleon in Egypt playthrough, The next video will be the lies video, but it will only be for channel members, or you can check it out on Patreon. You can find both channel memberships and the Patreon down below, so if you would like to see that and other regular content, then please check out the Patreon and channel memberships. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope y'all are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.